Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're really delighted to be joined by Bridgette Carr. Bridgette is a distinguished clinical law professor at University of Michigan, and she's widely recognised for her understanding of the complexities of sexual assault and human trafficking. And I read an article that you'd written, Bridgette, which spoke about the messiness of human trafficking and how that often seemed to become too complicated for the legal system to make sense of. So I thought it was a great article to read and so relevant to so much of what's going on in the world right now. So pleased you're able to join us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, Bridgette. It's very nice to meet you. And I gather you're based in Ann Arbor.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I've never been there, but it's a famous name. So, Bridgette, perhaps we could begin by you telling us how you found yourself to be an expert in trafficking, because it doesn't like the sort of occupation or career that most people aspire to.
Right. It was a total fluke for me. I actually am a first-generation college graduate for my family and had dreams of going to med school. And on the fifth day, realized that medical school was not a fit for me. It did not feed my soul. So I dropped out. So I'm a dropout. And I had to figure out what was next. And I was deciding between law school and a master's in social work, and picked law and really thought I would be an immigration and refugee attorney. And I was doing that work when the first ever federally prosecuted human trafficking case in Michigan found me. And I said no, and it persisted, and I had no clue what I was doing, but none of us did. However, those of us who worked on the case became experts by default after working on that case, and then more cases showed up. And then at some point, I actually became an expert, but it definitely took a while.
Well, yeah, it's interesting the way you describe that, and it's surprising how common that kind of pathway is for people, that it almost becomes an accident and then something they become passionate about.
Yes. And I think, I tell my students this all the time. I always tried to make decisions about if this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life, whatever this is, would it feed my soul? Would I be happy and satisfied? And the answer has generally been yes. And so I would be happy with lots of different paths in my life, I think.
Thank you. So would you like to tell us something about trafficking? What exactly is trafficking?
Right. So lots of countries have their own trafficking laws, but the general sort of like recognized definition, I like to talk about it in lay people's terms. It's really when someone's compelled into service, and that service can be landscaping, working in the back of a restaurant, or it can be in the commercial sex industry. And then the compulsion, how someone sort of is stuck there, can take lots of different permutations. For some, it's age. They're too young to be able to consent to the type of work they're doing. For others, it's force or fraud or coercion. And so we should really, really ask the question of, is someone being compelled to do this work for someone else's financial benefit?
So something to do with coercion, really. Coercion more than travel, really.
Yes, travel does not have to be a component of trafficking. It can be. Travel is one of the ways someone could get in contact with a person. But I actually think that, I talk about trafficking really as being a crime of relationships. So almost all my clients knew their trafficker either as an employee or family friend or loved one before they were exploited. And so I think we really do ourselves a disservice when we accept the pop cultural narrative that trafficking victims are snatched, when the reality is that most trafficking situations occur because of relationships.
Thank you. And does the trafficking usually or always involve some other kind of victimization of the individual?
So I think that at the core of trafficking is when someone with power exploits a vulnerability. And so that vulnerability can be a wide variety of things. It can be someone's immigration status. It can be someone's history as a sexual assault survivor. It can be someone's addiction to substances. And then I've even worked on cases where someone's commitment to athletics in the Olympic system has been used as a way to exploit them. And so it doesn't have to include physical violence. It can be purely psychological coercion. However, psychological coercion is abuse. So we always see abuse of some sort, but it doesn't have to be physical abuse or even a physical restriction of someone's freedom of movement or liberty.
Thank you, Bridgette. So we know that the Jeffrey Epstein case has brought a lot of attention to this particular crime. And in the UK, we also had the Rochdale and Rotherham child abuse cases, which are highly topical. They're in the headlines at the moment. And the perpetrators in these cases were accused of sex trafficking. Is it much more common than we tend to think?
I think that trafficking, both sex and labor, are much more common than most people think because the media and movie versions of trafficking are that it's like a unicorn, meaning it's super unique, right? It will only happen when the organized crime, evil men come and physically snatch a totally innocent victim and put them in special transportation and spirit them away. And if that was trafficking, well, one, my job would be way easier because all of the cameras that exist in our society would catch most of that. But two, it would be quite rare. When at the end of the day, I say that trafficking isn't a unicorn. It's way more like horses. It's just super pedestrian, happens a lot because people want to make money and profit and are open to taking advantage of vulnerabilities. And then the other thing that trafficking requires that I can at least say Americans are pretty good at is we're willing to look the other way often when people are exploited. We're not willing to speak up. We're not willing to talk about abuse that's happening around us. Sadly, I think that's a global phenomenon, not just an American one. And so when you add in that willingness to be quiet, plus a willingness for people to profit off vulnerability, trafficking's just very common.
So are you suggesting then, Bridgette, that trafficking, in a way, in some places, in some situations, is a kind of almost industrial activity, a bit like the taking of refugees across our channel in tiny inflatable boats, which is obviously a highly organised crime?
Well, when you look at, for example, the US agricultural system, and there have been many reports that have likened it to trafficking just by definition, there's just no way that our crops get picked and people get paid fair wages over the time it takes, and we can still pay the prices that we pay at the grocery store. So I don't think US farmers have a magical way to grow free strawberries. I think that the way that profits are being saved or made is off both government subsidies, but also off the backs of the agricultural workers. Now, does that mean every single worker is a trafficking victim? Of course not. But does it mean here is an example of sort of an industry that needs this type of economic exploitation to survive in its current structure? Definitely.
Right, well, that's quite shocking, isn't it? Bridgette, you wrote an excellent article on how this crime was being overlooked in the Al-Fayed Harrods case that's being investigated currently. Why is it so crucial to understand if trafficking is part of the picture?
So I think it's so important to see trafficking as a systemic issue because if we have the narrative that someone's just a serial sexual assaulter or an evil person or a bad person, then we can say, but for that bad actor, this experience or this exploitation would not have occurred. And yes, that's true, right? We need a perpetrator. That's always going to be part of the equation. But the reality is that the perpetrator, especially from what I understand of the Al-Fayed case, the Epstein case is another example, needs the systems that they have set up around them, or the people that they have set up around them, to exploit the number of individuals that Epstein and Al-Fayed have been accused of exploiting. And so those are human beings that are a part of those systems, at least as of right now. That's not AI, right? Those are human beings that are cutting checks, driving people, putting people in places. And so we can't ignore, one, the human beings that are part of those systems, but two, in many cases, the systems that then financially benefit from the exploitation of those human beings, and companies that make a ton of money. In the US right now, there is a case against the CEO of Abercrombie and Fitch for how the allegation is that he sex trafficked a number of models. Well, if you were alive in the 90s and paid attention to the Abercrombie advertising campaigns, you could see that the type of boys and men he's accused of exploiting were very much part of those advertising campaigns that the company made quite a bit of money off of. So we just can't separate out the people who help the perpetrator, but also then if there are companies created around that or sustained by that profit off of it.
You're really talking about the kind of like dark side of capitalism with all of this, aren't you? I mean, people on benefits get pilloried within the media for being lazy, good for nothings. But actually, part of this is our minimum. Most of these people are employed, and a lot of it is about the fact the minimum wage is not a livable wage, and so we're effectively subsidising all these millionaires, billionaires, with at the expense of the everyday person.
Right. I mean, a lot of people who hear me speak want to ask me, how can I help fight trafficking? What can I do? And they want me to say something really sexy, like fly down to the Dominican Republic and rescue kids. Don't do that. Or they want me to say something, super engaging and frontline. But the most powerful thing we could do, fight poverty, have a universal income, right? Make people less vulnerable. But no one seems to find those ideas very interesting, engaging, or sexy enough to want them to be part of the anti-trafficking platform. But it really is true, right? If you have to change one part of the power, vulnerability, willing to ignore equation, and people are going to have power. So I want to reduce vulnerability. That seems to me like a place to start.
Thank you. Well, you've mentioned poverty just now. Is there anything else that makes people vulnerable to trafficking? Is it something we can see? What does it look like?
So I think there are lots of things that can make people vulnerable to trafficking, but we definitely shouldn't overstate the specialty ones, right? So of course, highly trained. So if you've given years of your life to train for a very specific thing, someone within that system, like an athletic experience, could traffic you for sure, and we've seen some of that. But that's not the majority of my cases. The majority of my cases center around people who are trying to financially survive, or who, before the trafficker encountered them, have already experienced significant abuse. So many of my sex trafficking clients, before they were sex trafficked, were already sexually assaulted within their family systems or other ecosystems that they existed in, many at very young ages. And so traffickers are often just taking advantage of that. So I think we think about poverty, we think about the prevalence of sexual abuse, we think about lack of mental health support, and the need to support people who are using substances. Again, no one's super excited about those ideas. I mean, I am, but I think they're very basic. Like, how do we support humans more to be steadier on their feet? And if we did that, it would be much harder to traffic people. Oh, and immigration status, of course. If you're somewhere and you don't have immigration status, that makes you very vulnerable.
Yeah, it sounds like the traffickers often have something that the person trafficked really wants, and a lot of the time that might just be money, but it could be some other, like you say, immigration or fame or success.
Or attachment, actually, right? Mm-hmm. So it could be money, but often money is sold to people as part of a bigger story of how we could build a life together, right? Especially if you target individuals who don't have, loving parents or are searching for a romantic attachment, and you built this promise of this life together. That, I think, sometimes even more than money, is what can be the psychological coercion, right? That they believe this idea of what they're going to build with the perpetrator, and the hope and excitement about a life like that for someone who loves them.
And I think you can very much see that in the cases of, the cases David referred to earlier, the sort of sex trafficking of children, teenage girls, and they thought these men were their boyfriends because they were, hanging out with them and giving them cigarettes and a few coins. But ultimately, it seems to be that wish for someone to love them and value them that put them in that position of vulnerability. But I guess we also see that with adults as well. That vulnerability and that wish to be loved doesn't go away because you reach adulthood, does it?
It doesn't. And I think often if you've reached adulthood with that need still inside you, you may then also already be addicted to substances or other things. I mean, we see the interconnectedness of so many of those things. I think it's harder to legislate that the government provides everyone with a stable attachment figure. So I think I'll keep pushing for universal income. But both would be great. If you could fix attachment and universal income, I feel like trafficking would go way down.
So why do you think we find it so hard to recognise trafficking? Because it does seem to be, like you say, presented as a unicorn.
So I think one is, if we actually were really going to grapple with trafficking, we would have to stop talking about just sex trafficking and really start talking about the goods and services that all of us, including the three of us, consume on a daily basis. And that's uncomfortable, and people don't want to be uncomfortable, right? So people want me to come talk, and they'll ask me questions about how do I keep my daughter safe if she goes to, somewhere on spring break. And I actually want to talk about, hey, we're all consumers of goods and services created by labor trafficking victims. And so what does that mean for us, and what needs to change if we really care about trafficking? But I think the answer is it's uncomfortable, and the reality is that it's at so much of the core of our economic system, and it can feel overwhelming. Like, where do I start? People, I think, often have the expectation that I must live a life that I don't consume those goods and services. Of course I don't. Like, I couldn't possibly, right? Unless I homesteaded and had no time other than just, milling my own flour and weaving my own clothes.
Thank you. I suppose I'm quite curious also about the boundary between victim and perpetrator, because I think certainly David and I both spent a lot of time working in prisons, and what you see in prisons is a lot of men who as teenage boys were groomed into gang culture, drug dealing, crime. And I think what we also saw that, I think, with the Epstein case, with some of the women who were trafficked as teenage girls had recruited other girls, so it then becomes quite hard to see who victim and perpetrator are. Do you think that confuses the picture?
I think it confuses the picture because we want, right, as human beings in general, very clear good person, bad person, evil person, right, saving person. You see that even when we talk about stranger danger and sexual abuse and all that, right? We want those narratives to be really clean. I think what we have to be willing to do is to say there's one question about who our legal system should say are perpetrators and victims, right? Like, that's one question. But then we have to have an openness that individuals within those experiences may identify people differently, right? And you can see it start. You can see some acceptance and awareness that people may have affection for their perpetrators. Like, we see some of that. But we see less of a willingness to say that this survivor may also have perpetrated, right, crimes against someone during the trafficking, but that survivor was never free of the trafficking. So for me, that's when I'm asked the question of how should the legal system draw those lines, I say the survivor needs to have an opportunity to be free and healed from that experience before we can say that his or her actions should be legally culpable. Now, that doesn't mean that another survivor can't feel or know that that person harmed them, right? All of those things can be true at the same time. But I think we want to be careful about why we're drawing those lines and for what purpose.
That's quite a confusing picture, though, isn't it? And how do you find justice for the person who's the last of those individuals to be harmed?
Yes. Well, I think it's probably true that for me, I think that question of how do you find justice, like, many of my clients don't actually want a criminal legal prosecution. They want something more. They want or different. They want an apology.
Mm-hmm.
They want something else. And so I think that is such a individual question. And I wish we could spend more time trying to figure that out for individuals. And I wish our legal systems were more flexible to be able to do some of those things better, because I know that there are many trafficking cases that I've worked on where the prosecutor or others say, look at this victory. We put the perpetrator away for 22 years. And my client, who was forced to testify, naked pictures of her shown in open court, she didn't want to do it. It re-traumatized her. Boy, that doesn't feel like a victory to her.
Yeah. Sounds like you're arguing a case more for things like restorative justice as a way forward in these kind of complex cases where there's multiple victims and enablers for the people who perhaps aren't at the top.
That, and I also just think we have to recognize that in so many of these cases, because they're relationship based, right? Relationships are going to continue long after the legal system is out of the picture. And so what does it look like to try to use other tools like restorative justice to say, now we're never going to return someone to the situation they were in before they were abused, right? Like that doesn't happen. But how can we make it as good as we possibly can with the tools we have to try to help someone find a way forward for themselves in life?
Bridgette, does the sex of the victim affect our ability to observe trafficking, do you think? Do we find it easier to recognise when women are trafficked than men?
I think in sex trafficking, we find it easier to recognize when women are trafficked. I think we have a real resistance to labor trafficking just overall. Mm-hmm. And then likely within that, we're probably more resistant to men. But I think that folks want to think of vulnerability as being weaker. And so add in misogyny, and that puts women in the weaker camp. But yeah, I think and then the media portrayals are almost always of women. And so it will be really interesting to see how the case I mentioned earlier, the Abercrombie case, plays out and what the evidence shows, because that is kind of one of, the few that I can think of cases really centered on boys and sex. And so how will decision makers think about that case?
You wonder in some cases like that one whether we're sometimes a bit dazzled by image, whether that be to do with wealth or status or what have you, because I think wasn't he the guy who insisted that everyone who worked in his shops had to be physically attractive, which ought to be a bit of an alarm.
Yeah, I don't know what the requirements were, but I remember going to the mall when I was a young girl, and everyone seemed to be very physically attractive who worked in the store. But I also think, the modeling industry, there are just some industries that I think the average person doesn't have a lot of information about to understand how economically vulnerable everyone who's not at the top already is within those industries. And so I think to understand a case like the Abercrombie case, you have to understand the modeling industry and what that type of opportunity would mean to someone, and how, people in that field are often juggling multiple jobs just to try to survive, to try to make it in that space. But, I think it's just an ignorance in general of labor conditions for so many people in most places.
Okay.
So you've touched upon this already, Bridgette, but while you've been talking, I've been thinking about a time when I was in Santa Barbara, staying in, I don't know if you know Santa Barbara, but they have these nice little, they're like posh motels, really. You park in front of your apartment. And I remember one particular one where I'd come out in the morning and there'd be 3 or 4 or 5 gardeners around the place, which seemed quite a lot to me. And they all appeared to come from, to my uneducated British eyes, from South America. So I'm thinking now, well, this is all probably was all part of a similar kind of situation that you've been describing. So apart from strawberries and farming, are we all complicit in this process?
I mean, I think we are. and part of it is because, right, like we accept this narrative from corporations that they can't trace their supply chains. Like if that was important, they could, right? Like there are all these incentives to not do it because when you know, you become culpable, and the law is problematic in that too. Like what if we made the law like that the more you know about your supply chain, better off you are. The less responsible you would be if something bad was found in it, unless you were the direct perpetrator. We could create legal systems like that, right? But we've created different ones with different incentives. And so I think, we're culpable for not demanding that we know more about where the goods and services that we consume. And yet I also recognize that all of us are also in these economic systems that are wearing us all down and exhausting us all, and we're all dealing with our own mental health and those sorts of things. And so it's complex. I don't think we should feel bad that we're complicit. I think we just have to recognize it and then say, what little part might I be able to do, or who might I be able to vote for that aligns with these values if this is something that's important to you.
Thank you. There are quite a number of businesses which claim to know about the origins of their produce, and I'm wondering whether that's a secondary business in producing at the very least slightly deceptive evidence about some of these situations.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I can't speak for why corporations make the decisions they do, but we've started this project actually at the Michigan Law School in conjunction with some other folks who are actually trying to figure out if we can identify, at least at the end, supply chains of agricultural products by using social media, because people post about where they buy their blueberries or whatever, and whether they're good or bad. And we've been doing it for about 2.5 years, and we actually we can start with a farm and look at their product and then go, so-and-so posted on this day that she was at this store and got a set of whatever it is and didn't like it or loved it. And so I think in the coming years, with the rise of AI and other things, it'll be very interesting. Can we leverage the fact that people just talk a lot about what they buy and what they use in ways that can actually connect up supply chains, maybe that corporations haven't been incentivized to do, but for those of us that care about exploited labor, we can use all this coming technology for good.
People are very good at talking about that when it comes to the climate, aren't they? In terms of thinking about, if I buy these blueberries from Chile or wherever, the air miles and what impact it's having on the environment. It seems as much less concern for human life.
Yes, this is something I think that will puzzle me for the rest of my life. I can't tell you, I live in, as you mentioned, Ann Arbor, a very progressive town. And for years, I've gone to restaurants where people ask about how was the cow treated, how was the chicken allowed to roam? And I've never had one of my friends, like these are my good friends who know what I do, say, hey, are you paying the dishwashers a fair wage? Do you have any knowledge about the person who butchered this cow, how they're treated? It is a total mystery to me how either the human lobby failed to include the human in the food process or the animal lobby managed to trump the humans. I don't know. But yes, I feel that deeply all the time. And I wish I could flip a switch, because it's clear that people want to make informed, smart consumer decisions when possible and when they have the resources to do so. But unfortunately, humans just aren't often in that narrative.
As you were talking, I was reminded we had a conversation with Isle Press, who wrote Dirty Work, and he talks about abattoir workers, for instance, with people doing jobs that are not jobs that most people would want to do, and the impact of that. So there's a lot of overlap, really. But I'm also conscious of the fact that you founded the Human Trafficking Clinic, and I wondered if you'd like to tell us a bit about the work of the clinic.
Sure. So I'm super proud of the work of the clinic. So law school clinics, I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but in the US, all law schools have clinics. It's where students practice being real lawyers under a faculty member's bar license. And so all states have laws that allow this. And so we were the first human trafficking clinic in the United States, and we provide free and excellent, or the students fail, but no, they always do a fantastic job, legal services to survivors of trafficking. And our clients are men, women, and children, foreign nationals, and U.S. citizens, labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And we really try to meet whatever legal needs arise from the trafficking experience. So that could be things that listeners probably obviously think of, right? Like immigration relief or support in the criminal prosecution, if there is one. But there's also a whole host of things that folks probably don't think about that we do, like getting people's identities back, trying to repair credit history, trying to get rid of criminal convictions, dealing with custody issues when you share a child with your perpetrator. And so we're kind of a lawyer of all trades for trafficking survivors.
Yeah, you can see that it must overlap in lots of different branches of law. I don't even know whether trafficking is a special branch in itself or not. You know, I have criminal lawyers and you have family lawyers, but
there is a casebook in the U.S. that I was one of the authors on. But yes, no, it's just a kind of a general like poverty law office, you know, like a legal aid office. We're only able to do this variety of cases that we do because we sit at a law school with so much expertise. And then there are 18 other clinics at Michigan Law that we can tap into their knowledge, especially the tax clinic is super helpful in our work because tax law kind of doesn't care if you've been trafficked, if you were supposed to be making money, which has been a whole interesting process. And so, yeah, so we're so lucky to have the type of support at Michigan Law that we have to do this work. And yeah, it's been really, really fun.
Well, it's interesting to hear you use the word fun because it also sounds quite depressing. Some of the stories that you must encounter must be quite difficult. And yet, I know when we spoke previously, you spoke about the long-term nature of some of your involvements, and wonder if that's part of what contributes to the sense of fun.
So I think I definitely don't want to minimize the horrible experiences my clients have had, and I also want to remind folks that it is just part of these people's lives, right? Like they had whole lives before I encountered them, and hopefully they'll have whole lives after we support them and meet their goals. And so I just feel so lucky compared to some of my co-professionals in these spaces that for us, because our involvement is often so varied in our clients' lives, that the story doesn't begin and end with the trafficking situation. It often includes, how to help someone get to college, or like how to, we get the invitations to the weddings. And so we are constantly reminded of the broader humanity of our clients because of the duration of time, and also because of the gift we have that we are not a legal aid organization that has to serve 1,000 clients a month, that we can really take our time. And then I also have the students who are learning how to be lawyers. And, I'm reminded every semester, especially as a first gen person, this is some really cool work that we get invited to do for people, that we're invited to try to help them meet their goals. And that lawyering, I know so many lawyers are jaded and on substances and unhappy, but for me, it remains, even this many years in, that lawyering is a superpower. I cannot believe I have been given the tools in my toolbox to help people in this way. And I'll also say I have a secondary trauma therapist, and I take that very seriously. And we teach techniques to our students, and I have to exercise and meditate and all of those things. And I view that as part of my 9-to-5 job, to do all of those things, to keep my brain as healthy as it can be, to keep doing this work.
It was good to hear you talking about the humanity of people and how reminded of the whole humanity you are in doing the work that you're doing. And I wondered if that was part of the problem in terms of the whole trafficking picture, that for many, quite often, these people who end up in a situation of being trafficked, they've been dealt with as other in some way, so seen as being in some ways less human for circumstances that are beyond their control. But whether that facilitates the looking away, if you like.
Yeah, I always say that traffickers need communities to be willing to see human beings as commodities. And we're really good at it. Anytime we call a human being illegal, we're helping traffickers. Anytime we actually speak about things like, well, how can we make sure our children are safe? I push back on groups and I say, who are we talking about? Are we talking about white kids? Like, are we talking about white wealthy kids? Are we just talking about wealthy kids who live in our zip code? Like, who is the R? Because the reality is the chances of my kids being trafficked so much lower statistically than the chances of other kids I can think of. So we don't need to be talking about how to keep my kids safe if they're going on spring break, right? Like, and so I think it's very important when we think about the language that we use, right? Is someone's humanity illegal? Are there in groups and out groups? That language, as we've just seen throughout history, is so powerful. And I'll never forget, I heard this interview from a child soldier one time who talked about how quickly he could be dehumanized and turned into a weapon of war, but how hard and arduous and how much time it took to find his way back, in his words, to his full humanity. And so I just think that process can be so quick. And I wish it was the other way in our brains, but it doesn't seem to be.
But it also sounds like your long-term connection involvement with people means that you also do get to see people regain their full sense of humanity, even though that might buck against what's been imposed on them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also how we teach our clinic. One of the exercises we start our clinic off on is we do this icebreaker with the students, and we ask them to identify 4 things that are the same in your group and 1 difference. And then we put all the group stuff up on the board, the whiteboard. And then we actually go through and say, most of our clients would have this in common with you. Like, we remind our students that our clients are already kind of just like them, right? And then not, but that, and because I think it can be so quick, when something can feel extreme or hard or traumatic, we want to distance ourselves from it, right? And so we work so hard both to say to our students, like, you're safe. And if you're safe, you can hold space without taking yourself out of the picture for people who need to tell you about hard things.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridgette. That was a very, very powerful account of your work, and so clear. Thanks very much indeed. Great to meet you.
Thank you
for having me.